I want to start, I suppose, first of all, by considering to what extent you, while working with President Obama in the roles I've mentioned, at the State Department particularly, to what extent were you planning even then for Russian aggression and dealing with Russian aggression?
Well, obviously, after the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, there was an awakening by many that Russia was not the country that many had invested a great amount of their careers and a great amount of hope in the 1990s in terms of trying to knit Russia, as well as a number of others who had lived under Soviet totalitarian rule, into a freer, democratic, more prosperous world. And so there had already been a bit of a wake up. But their hope springs eternal, and I think it ought to spring eternal. We should still want that for the Russian people. We should still want them to live in a free society with leaders of their own choosing. But certainly, by the time I got to the OSCE, in late 2013, that's when the Revolution of Dignity started, and many people remember it starting because the Russian-friendly leader, then leader of Ukraine, had turned away from the EU and toward Russia. And indeed, that was the original catalyst of the student protest. But it really, really swelled into the million-person protest that we saw when his security services cracked down on those students and cracked their skulls together in a very bloody crackdown. And that was what provoked the Ukrainian people to come out and say, we don't want to live like this anymore. And obviously, the revolution of dignity was followed by Putin's first invasion of Ukraine, and the events of the last week have been incredibly sobering to see
Yeah,
what the second looks like.
absolutely. And you mentioned that annexation then of Crimea, which was in 2014. I suppose in hindsight, was the kind of relative unpunishment in that situation, the relative ease with which Russia and Putin was able to carry that out, was how big a mistake was that?
I mean, there were enormous sanctions delivered at that time, not compared to what we've seen in the last week, which has been truly historic. But I think there's also, I think it's important not to blame ourselves for what Putin has done wrong. And at that time, I think in his own mind, his strategic play was that he was going to grab hold of a piece of Ukraine and use it as the tail to wag the Ukrainian dog, as it were. And in the last 8 years, we've seen the Ukrainian people actually continue to pursue a democratic future, and that is something that Putin himself cannot tolerate, because the possibility of the example of a comparison of a free and democratic Ukraine would be so damaging to the legitimacy of his own rule, his own increasingly authoritarian rule at home in Russia.
Mm. And so we turn to the sobering events then of the last week or so. I suppose first of all, I mean there are various notable things here. Perhaps first of all, the kind of way in which the EU, the US, and the UK, and indeed other countries from around the world have really combined to build pressure on Russia in really an unprecedented way.
It's completely unprecedented, and I think frankly people are surprising themselves. There are plenty of people in Washington and London and Berlin and Paris who I imagine are quite surprised to see how strong the solidarity has been. I would add to that, obviously Canada, but also Japan, Switzerland joined the sanctions today. That I think a lot of people might have been surprised to think about that even a week ago. The solidarity that you've seen from the world in saying to Putin, this is not on, this is not acceptable, this is not how we live in the 21st century, is really impressive. And I think it sends a message not only to Putin, but also to others.
Give us an insight into how tough it is to deal with Putin, and I'm asking this particularly in the context of his kind of threats of nuclear escalation. That must be a tough situation for policymakers, and I think you even have observed this online that these threats, they have to be taken seriously, but at the same time you need to kind of try to avoid giving them legitimacy, I suppose.
I think that's exactly right. And, I think um, those of us who are not in government can often submit to the temptation of saying, well, they should do this, they should have this person call that. And frankly, I hope and trust that those on both sides of the Atlantic who are in senior positions and national security positions are doing that. Certainly, there's been lots of wargaming and practice to kind of identify opportunities to de-escalate away from a threshold that would be nuclear. And so people have inherited wisdom of a couple generations of trying to predict that. We should leave that to the government. The government should be responsible with that. But one of the things that we can all do, no matter where we are, is reaffirm the norm that it is absolutely morally outrageous for any leader to threaten to launch a nuclear attack like this. And I think Putin should be roundly condemned for a moral travesty and even hinting at that. It is unacceptable and it is absolutely immoral, and we should reaffirm the moral prohibition against doing so.
Mm. And I suppose to follow on from that, we are reporting this morning that the International Criminal Court's prosecutor says he wants to investigate Russia for possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. And some of the footage that's emerged from Ukraine in the last few days suggests that perhaps that won't be all that difficult a case to make, I suppose. I guess, though, with that, is the announcement of that sort of investigation, is there a risk here that that is in some ways provocation to Putin, that it just escalates this crisis further?
Again, I think one always has to be careful. Of course, one should be looking for opportunities to de-escalate something that is having an enormous cost in human lives. But I think one has to be careful not to blame oneself for escalation when this is obviously a horror that has been launched by Putin. I don't know that Putin cares all that much, at least today, about that investigation. I am deeply worried that not only have the events that have transpired so far in the last week warranted the opening of such an investigation, but that Putin is, as we've heard, I mean, some of the latest intelligence that is being released on this side of the Atlantic, or that is leaking out on this side of the Atlantic, is that US officials feel confident that Putin is deeply frustrated by the way that the first few days of the war have gone, and that they haven't gone according to his plans. And I think it's very frightening that while they have gone much better than expected in Ukraine, that the coming days could be indeed very hard. And I think we may have seen a preview of that in Kharkiv over the last 48 hours. And a lot of people may not realize, but Kharkiv would be a city that would feel quite familiar to many people in England, many people in the United States. It is a modern city. It has a high-speed rail between Kyiv and Kharkiv. It's certainly nicer than a lot of the trains in the United States. Certainly as modern as any trains that you would find in England. And I think it's really horrifying to watch the footage of indiscriminate bombing on the second largest city in Ukraine.
Daniel, I really appreciate your insight, your analysis, and your expertise. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Calum.
Thanks. All the best. That's Daniel Baer, Acting Director of the Europe Programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served on